Chapter 1. Immediate divergence. The first sign isn't a missile, it's silence. At 2:17 a.m., fiber routes blink out across the Taiwan Strait, and half the island's network map turns grey like a power grid after a storm. Airlines don't announce cancellations. They simply stop filing flight plans. By sunrise, Beijing publishes a notice that reads like an administrative memo and lands like a threat. A temporary maritime safety zone, a routine exercise, a warning that all vessels should avoid specified corridors for their own protection. Taipei doesn't treat it as routine. It treats it as the preface to a sentence the world has been afraid to finish. Within hours, social media fills with shaky clips of jets over water and ships in long, disciplined lines. In the same hours, a different flood arrives. Text messages claiming the government has fled. Audio recordings leaked from fake emergency meetings. Screenshots of forged orders telling reservists to stand down. The goal isn't persuasion, it's vertigo. Taiwan's leadership goes live and keeps going live. Short statements, clear instructions. The same 3 points repeated until repetition becomes armor. Stay calm. Verify information. Report sabotage. Then the power goes out in a cluster of districts that don't share geography. Not a citywide blackout. Targeted surgical darkness that says someone is inside the system, watching switches. Beijing doesn't call it an invasion. It calls it a reunification operation designed to prevent separatist provocation. The phrasing is careful. So careful it convinces no one. And then the strait changes character. Commercial shipping turns away, not because it is ordered to, but because insurers refuse to touch the risk. Tankers drift outside declared zones, waiting for clarity that never comes. Ferries stop. Fishing boats return to port early. The water that used to be busy becomes empty, and emptiness becomes the loudest sound on the island. Taiwan's military raises readiness without theatrics. No triumphal speeches, no dramatic parades, just roadblocks that appear like punctuation, and sirens tested once, twice, until everyone understands the meaning. Across the Pacific, the United States holds an emergency call with allies that lasts long enough to become its own headline. Japan watches the strait and watches its own southern islands. The Philippines watches its northern coast and remembers old maps. Australia watches fuel routes and quietly begins moving inventory that never makes the news. Europe watches in disbelief, then in calculation, because disbelief does not change shipping schedules. In Beijing, the leadership tells itself the world will blink. In Taipei, the leadership tells itself the island cannot afford to. Between them is a narrow stretch of water that has stopped being geography. It has become a deadline. Chapter 2. Short-term consequences. The operation begins with pressure, not occupation. Pressure is cheaper. Pressure also looks reversible, which makes foreign capitals hesitate. Chinese ships and aircraft don't need to sink anything to change everything. They only need to make the strait feel like a trap. Within days, Taiwan's ports work at a fraction of normal pace. Containers back up. Fuel deliveries become unpredictable. Factories start calculating hours the way hospitals calculate oxygen. Taiwan's government moves fast to ration without using that word. It asks the public to conserve. It prioritizes certain industries. It tells people to keep cash on hand, and then immediately regrets the advice when lines form at ATMs. The information war sharpens. Every successful defense becomes a rumor of failure. Every minor outage becomes total collapse. Every traffic accident becomes martial law. Taiwan's real advantage, competence, becomes harder to display, because competence doesn't go viral. Beijing keeps offering an off-ramp that isn't an off-ramp. Talks, it says. Peace, it says, but only after illegal authorities accept reality. Taipei refuses, because accepting the premise is surrender without a shot, and surrender is still surrender when you dress it in diplomacy. Then, the first kinetic exchange arrives, brief and terrifying in its restraint. A drone goes down over water. A warning shot is fired where no civilian camera can catch it clearly. Both sides issue statements that are designed to calm their own people and alarm the other sides. Markets don't wait for clarity. They never do. Shipping rates spike as if someone set them on fire. Semiconductor buyers start calling every foundry outside Taiwan with the same question. Scale. Now, the answer, everywhere, is the same. Not fast enough. Washington's dilemma becomes public in fragments. If it does nothing, the world learns that alliances are sentimental. If it moves too aggressively, the crisis becomes a war with no clean boundary. So it chooses a middle path that looks firm on paper and fragile in practice. More patrols, more intelligence sharing. A surge of air defenses and anti-ship systems to the region that are described as defensive the way umbrellas are defensive in a hurricane. Beijing responds by widening the zone. Not dramatically, just enough to force everyone else to redraw routes. Taiwan responds by mobilizing reserves and hardening facilities, trying to look prepared without looking panicked. That balance is impossible to hold for long. The public understands something governments often forget. Normal life is a supply chain. Once the chain rattles, fear becomes a second attacker. The first week ends without a decisive battle. That is not a relief. It is the shape of the trap. Because every day the blockade-like pressure holds, Taiwan bleeds time, money, and confidence. And every day it holds, Beijing learns it can change the world without crossing the line it claims it hasn't crossed. Chapter 3: Medium-Term Instability. The second month is where the crisis matures. Not into a war everyone recognizes, but into a grinding contest everyone feels. Taiwan adapts. It reroutes imports through smaller ports. It creates emergency stockpiles. It shifts power generation priorities. It becomes a country built around continuity plans. Continuity has a cost. Civil liberties compress at the edges, not by declaration, but by necessity. Phones are monitored more aggressively for disinformation networks. Suspicious transactions get frozen quickly. Volunteer patrols start appearing, and the government tries to formalize them before they become their own problem. Beijing adapts too. It discovers that strangling an economy is easier than controlling a society. Blockade pressure creates unity as often as it creates surrender. So Beijing changes the mix. More cyber attacks timed to weekends. More targeted disruptions aimed at utilities and logistics. More leaks designed to fracture trust between Taiwan's parties and between civilians and the military. Then the sanctions arrive in layers. The United States and partners restrict high-end technology exports and freeze certain assets. China counters by restricting critical minerals and applying pressure through its own market power. Countries that promised values begin counting percentages. Some comply. Some carve exceptions. Some declare neutrality and find out neutrality is expensive. In Europe, the debate becomes a mirror of every past dependency mistake. Factories want stability. Politicians want unity. Voters want prices to stop rising. The strait becomes the hidden reason behind layoffs, heating bills, and empty shelves that no one can name without starting another fight. Japan accelerates rearmament and civil defense with a speed that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The Philippines negotiates access agreements it once avoided because geography doesn't care about domestic politics. South Korea watches carefully and quietly revises its assumptions about what deterrence really deters. In Washington, the crisis starts devouring other priorities. Budgets get rewritten. Diplomacy becomes a permanent emergency. The administration stops talking about guardrails and starts talking about red lines, because language changes when patience runs out. Inside Taiwan, the pressure produces a different kind of fracture. Not between those who want to resist and those who want to yield. Between those who can keep living and those who can't. Small businesses fail first. Rent gets harder. Prices climb in ways that don't look dramatic until a cashier says a number out loud and you realize it has become normal. People begin leaving, not in waves, in streams, students with visas, engineers with recruiters, families with relatives abroad. Each departure is rational. Together they become a quiet emergency. Beijing points to the departures as proof the island is collapsing. Taipei calls it temporary and begs talent to stay. Neither side can control what stress does to a population. And as weeks turn into months, the central truth becomes unavoidable. This is not a crisis that will end with a single decision. It is a new climate. Chapter 4. Long-term global changes. By the second year, the world has adapted in the way it always adapts, not by solving the problem, but by building around it. Semiconductor supply chains split. New plants in the United States, Japan, and Europe expand, but they expand like concrete dries, slowly and never without cracks. Products ship with longer lead times. Innovation shifts toward what can be produced reliably, not what can be imagined boldly. Global trade rewires itself under stress. Shipping avoids the strait when it can. Insurance costs become a permanent tax on Asia's coastal economies. Energy markets stay jumpy because one announcement can still send tankers drifting and prices climbing. The internet changes too, not in a dramatic blackout, but in a gradual hardening. More national firewalls, more fractured app ecosystems, more trusted networks that are really polite names for blocks. Diplomacy becomes less about persuasion and more about alignment. The language of partners returns, heavy with implication. So does the language of self-reliance, which sounds empowering until you realize it often means alone. In Taiwan, life continues under a permanent readiness posture. Schools run drills that children treat as routine. Companies budget for outages and disruptions the way they used to budget for marketing. Politics becomes narrower because the range of acceptable uncertainty shrinks. The island doesn't collapse, it hardens. Beijing claims victory anyway, not the victory it promised on day one, but a victory of demonstration. It has shown that it can impose strategic pain without triggering the kind of full-scale response its leaders feared. That lesson echoes outward. Other flashpoints heat up, not because anyone wants war, but because everyone learns that pressure campaigns work. Meanwhile, militaries everywhere get bigger. Defense budgets rise and stay high. Conscription expands in places that swore it never would. Arms control talks stall, then fade into nostalgia, because trust becomes the rarest resource on the planet. And in the background, another shift settles in. The world stops believing that economic interdependence prevents conflict. It starts believing the opposite, that interdependence is leverage. That leverage will be used, that the only safety is distance. Distance in a global economy is another word for loss. Chapter 5. Final outcome. The invasion everyone imagined never arrives in the form they expected. No single day of flags on government buildings. No clean surrender scene that closes the chapter. Instead, the strait becomes a scar that never heals. After years of pressure, a ceasefire framework emerges that neither side calls a ceasefire. Shipping corridors reopen under inspection regimes that feel temporary and become permanent. Taiwan keeps its government, but its economy lives under a ceiling that can be lowered with a notice and a fleet. China doesn't control the island, but it controls the rhythm of the island's future. The United States doesn't lose the region, but it loses something harder to measure. The assumption that credibility is binary. In this world, credibility becomes a subscription service. Paid in deployments, paid in subsidies, paid in constant crisis management. And the real irreversible consequence isn't territorial. It's psychological. Every major country builds its next decade around one premise, that the global system can be bent without breaking. So they start bending it preemptively. Stockpiles, industrial policy, domestic alternatives to foreign suppliers, security screening for scientists, engineers, students, journalists. Borders that used to be about people become borders about knowledge. The planet does not slide into a single great war. It slides into a long era where peace is technically intact and practically exhausted, where companies build redundancy instead of dreams, where alliances are thicker, more exclusive and more brittle. where every small disruption is treated as rehearsal for a bigger one. Taiwan survives, but not as a symbol, as a warning. Because the lesson of the invasion isn't that the world could not stop it, it's that the world could not end it. Once pressure became normalized, it became a template, and templates spread faster than armies. Epilogue. The future isn't as stable as we pretend. A single fracture, and the future becomes unrecognizable. Until next time.